Shutters being opened at the Jane Austen House in Chawton, the house in which Jane lived with her sister and her mother.
It's so lovely to arrive here in the morning and fold back the shutters, thinking that this is probably the way Jane Austen started her day. She shared a room with her sister, so probably whoever woke up first. And when Maura asked about poetry based on windows, I remember starting a little poem, I fold back the shutters, awakening the house.
Why do we come? Because she says what we think quietly. She says what we think wittily, with more wit, before we knew we thought it. Because we read her at school, at college, in bed alone. We made a life teaching others about her, and we like the dresses. Because we know about Shakespeare, Heathcliff, Harry Potter and Jane, and they said that a day out with a pub lunch is an English tradition. Because a parent said, "Here, you might like this one." And we tried it. And we did.
I think my first one was Emma, and I read that one, and even though it was written so long ago, it spoke to me. It really did. It was just as funny. And then, of course, the BBC put out the Pride and Prejudice with Colin Firth, and then, after that, immediate fan. I'm Jennifer Davis from Paducah, Kentucky, in America. I hate to be trite, but it gives me chills when I think about when I walked in here, and I know this isn't her actual bed, but just seeing things and knowing that she's been here, it's thrilling. It really is.
I'm Anne Channon. When I first came, I was a cleaner and then got involved in the garden and then the house itself. I looked after the brick and tile. When you clean somewhere, as I did for years, you know every screw and nail on the floorboard, you know what's going to come up and catch somebody's shoe. That needs attending to. All the gutters are overflowing, all the drains are blocked. You get really involved with the whole brick and tile. And I love the Admiral's Room, which while it is new floorboards from 1985, they're the last of the elm. And they're golden and it just glows. It glows with life, this house.
I think when I was in college, I read Pride and Prejudice as part of a great books program back in the United States in Missouri. For me, it's very impressive to see who she was as a woman writer, particularly of her time, of a couple centuries ago, and the fact that she was able to step forward in a way to express her thoughts about the society of the day as a woman writer. And I think for me, that's a very special and impressive thing.
In this room, then there are 3 cabinets, and they display different things to do with Jane Austen and with life here. And the central cabinet here fascinated me because it has a little label which says "Objects found under the floorboards," and that in itself is quite enticing. But then when you look a little closer and you see what they were, and there is a quill sharpener, little bits of quill, all kinds of different things. It's quite extraordinary. Objects found under the floorboards. A penknife, a spoon, a hinge, a file, a stopper. We cannot explain the things brought up from under. The small gun, the pipe, a doll's plate, a button, stained or dusty, bright and brassy, forgotten. The familiar strange, a story we try to place, still lives, held in wait so patiently. That face?
I work with people of all ages, school groups, older groups, just engaging with as many people as possible with Jane Austen and the works of Jane Austen. I'm Annalie Talent, and I'm the Learning Officer here at Jane Austen's House Museum.
Annalie, we're looking through the window here into the kitchen. We can see lots of people milling about. There's a table and they're trying to write with quill pens, and people trying on bonnets and Regency costumes and really enjoying having a look around what would have been the kitchen for the Austen household. And Martha Lloyd, their friend who lived with them, kept a household book which had recipes in and all sorts of other things. And I wonder, can you tell us about that and how much they used it and what sort of book that was?
Martha Lloyd, she kept this household book full of recipes for food, all sorts of different types of food. Not grand food though, because of course remember that the Austens living here at the cottage, it was quite a modest household. But at the back of the book also we have a lot of receipts or recipes for household products. So we have a recipe for making ink, a receipt for whitening silk stockings, a certain cure for the consumption, all sorts of things that they would have found very useful. And Martha kept this. It was a handwritten book. This is a recipe for thin cream pancakes called Quire of Paper. Take to a pint of cream 8 eggs, leaving out 2 whites, 3 spoonfuls of fine flour, 3 spoonfuls of sack and 1 spoonful of orange flower water, a little sugar, a grated nutmeg and a 1/4 pound of butter melted in the cream. Mingle all well together, mixing the flour with a little cream at first that it may be smooth. Butter your pan for the first pancake and let them run as thin as possible to be whole. When one side is coloured, it is enough. Take them carefully out of the pan and strew some fine sifted sugar between each. Lay them as evenly on each other as you can. This quantity will make 20.
That was so beautiful, Annalie. I feel embarrassed to read my poem. That was more like a poem. the little poem I made of it, which is called Quire of Paper, because I was so taken with the name of the dish itself, because a quire, of course, is a quantity of paper. And if you make a decent pancake, it's supposed to be so thin, isn't it? When you hold it up, you should be able to read through it. So I love that idea. Quire of Paper. A froth heated just enough to settle and firm, or crisp lightly at the edges. Delicate. A mixture to reward the pressure of attention with sustenance, new flavour, delicious, and fine enough to let the light flood through.
Well, my name is Fazia Baksh. I'm from South America. I've read her stories, I've seen her, the movie. This is why I want to dress up like her, to feel like her, what she felt like. I wanted to do this, to be part of that. I'm happy to be here.
Looking in through the windows here, and we're looking in at actually a group of women who are all dressing up and imagining what it might have been like to have lived here perhaps at that time. What have you learnt in your time here about what Jane Austen's life might have been like as a writer?
I think she was lucky in that when she was living here, her sister Cassandra did sort of allow her the time and space to write. It was Cassandra that took over the sort of management of the household, whereas a lot of other women of the period, they wouldn't have had that opportunity. And if Jane Austen hadn't been given that chance, maybe we wouldn't have had the works that we have today. So sometimes when Cassandra was away, staying perhaps with her brother Edward in Kent, Jane Austen would have to take over the management of the household. And she once wrote in one of her letters that composition seems to me impossible with a head full of joints of mutton and doses of rhubarb, which I think sort of illustrates quite nicely how difficult she found it, sort of juggling the two, the domestic and the literary.
Don't we all know that? Jane loved to walk and she loved to escape from the house, perhaps, in a way. But most of her time would have been spent here, wouldn't it? And it would have been, if not writing, then working on embroidery, etc.
That's right. I think, as you say, Jane Austen did love walking and she did get out of the house a lot. And I think it must have given her such a sense of freedom because women of her class, they did spend such a lot of time at their home. As Catherine Morland's mother says to her in Northanger Abbey, she says, "Wherever you are, Catherine, you should always be content, but especially at home, for that is where you will spend most of your time."
We're in this room here with the shutters still closed to protect it, and we're looking at a wonderful quilt. And Susan Dell, you are part of the collections team here, but my idea of a quilt is something that is It's a bit more cobbled together, really, than this quilt appears to be, which seems to be so carefully designed, with one side of it matching every piece on the other side, and a particular pattern going through it and picked up here again and there again.
It is so beautifully designed. It's a large central diamond surrounded by 232 medium diamonds that are laid out in an absolutely geometric pattern. Those diamonds are then surrounded by about 2,500 tiny diamonds, just over an inch each side of the diamond.
From here, although we're just inches away, I can't even see a stitch. The stitches are so tiny.
Jane was immensely proud of her ability of stitching. In one of her letters, she boasts that they'd been making shirts for one of her brothers, and her needlework was definitely the best. She will talk about working with her sister or working with her mother. We spent an hour at work this morning. She means stitching.
The idea that when Jane Austen talks about her work, she doesn't mean her writing, which is what might be uppermost in my mind. She means her embroidery, she means her quilting, she means her handiwork.
Because that was the work that women did.
So my response to the quilt, which was when I was poet in residence here, was very much based on looking at it, trying to imagine what that little collection of women sitting around the table might have been sharing together, and listening, Sue, to some of the things that you had told me about the workings of the women together making quilts. So it begins with a line which is from a letter that Jane Austen wrote to her sister Cassandra in May of 1811. Have you remembered to collect pieces for the patchwork? The mind shakes out a bolt of plain muslin, which billows, then is caught, smoothed, held and pinned before the fussy cutting begins. The snipping and placing of pieces to make shape, pattern and shade. Precisely 12 stitches to the inch, tension perfected in a line of thread, in a lightning needle, in and out, sharp and fine, gleaming as it draws it all together. This is the donkey cart on which Jane and Cassandra would have gone into town in Alton. Alton is the nearest town where Jane's brother also had his bank. It's a beautiful little cart, about the size of a rickshaw maybe, with a lovely sort of sloping arm. I'm sure there's proper names for this, but I don't know what they are. And just about enough space for two ladies to sit. I was going to say comfortably, but I can't believe it would have been very comfortable actually. If you had any money at all, you would have had a rather smarter carriage and you'd have been led by horses. But this is just a little donkey cart for a household which was getting by on not very much. Considering the donkey cart. Here is the horse and carriage of a modest household, the means of escape on muddy days, drab days, days when to whisper into the tender ears that Midas wore, to tickle behind the teasing ears that Bottom disported, was to know the thrill of the open gate, the bright road stretching away. Ah, Jack, ah, Jenny. Ra chose you, Jesus chose you, Sancho chose you, but who can coax your bony back, your stony look, uncomfortable, unbiddable, mired happily, enduring, eschewing the tasty barley, chewing a thistle? Who can tempt you to carry the king with the golden crown, or lift these sisters' spirits with a day in town?
Come on, I'm on the foil, Jersey Royal! Jersey Royal new potatoes today, and English asparagus now.
I used to walk down through Alton, which is a little market town, busy, cheerful little place actually, and then come through and it becomes quieter. There's a village greeny part at the end called Alton Butts. And then, as you leave the village, suddenly you can hear the roar of traffic, and yet the signs are pointing you towards Jane Austen's house, which seems at odds because I know that actually it's in quite a quiet village. But then I discovered there's this huge road which runs just along the edge of the village, as you hear the huge road. And then rather a miraculous thing happens. We go under it and up the other side into Chawton. local on his run. And then as you go into the village, you lose the sound of the cars and you start to pick up the sound of the birds.
Some people come because they see it as a pilgrimage. They come from about, I think, 137 countries. I think two people that really stay in my mind is a Japanese professor who had saved for 50 years to come here, a lady, and who taught English and Jane Austen in Japan and just wept when she walked through the door. And then in the same week, an Indian gentleman professor who had first read Pride and Prejudice as a 12-year-old boy when he picked up a copy off the street in Delhi, and had worked and studied and was also teaching English literature in India.
I spent one rainy day reading through the visitors book because people come from all over the world, and just opening this at random now and looking at that list, you can see that just on one day, which was last week, people came from Hampshire, Bournemouth, Kentucky, Surrey, Houston, Philadelphia, Salt Lake City. Who else have we got here? Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Germany, just in a row. It gave me the idea for this poem, and the poem is entirely made up of just comments that I took from the visitors book. The visitors book. I am finally here, a place of pilgrimage. I am honoured to walk where once she walked. Her books have taught me to hope. Before, I scarcely ever allowed myself to hope. This place, full of secrets. Merveilleux, wunderschön, bellissimo, fantaberdosy. My sister, Jane. I'm bringing my dad. Standing in the room which Jane's sailor brothers would have stayed in when visiting, perhaps home from sea, I was very puzzled, trying to get a sort of sense of them, and then coming upon a recipe in Martha Lloyd's household book for milk of roses, and it had been put into the book as Captain Frank Austen's recipe. And it runs like this: 1/2 pint of rose water, 1/2 ounce of oil of sweet almond, 12 grains of salt of tartar to be mixed well together. And I was wondering why he would have had really a recipe for face cream.
The sun and the salt and the wind would have burnt them, would have made them very sore. So I think that salve would have served very well. Frank ended up ready to go to the Battle of Trafalgar and was one of Nelson's captains. He was sent to pick up supplies from Gibraltar, fresh water and some food. And Nelson said, you have to go, you have to take your turn. So they go off to Gibraltar, and while they're there, the wind changes, they can't get back, and all was done. Nelson was dead, and Frank writes this wonderful letter to his fiancée of the time, saying the loss of the man, the loss of this great man, and the loss of prize money as well.
Jane would have had, in these letters from her brothers and in their visits, a window into a different kind of world. How did she use what came through that window to her?
Well, in Mansfield Park, where she gives the gold chain and the topaz cross to Fanny, that is the gift that Charles gave to her and her sister, their topaz crosses and gold chains, with his first prize money. For Frank, you see more of him in persuasion and his skills, where Captain Harville is mending nets and turning pounce boxes and things like that. And in Mansfield Park, you're looking at trying to rise from a midshipman. So she would have known all that and the struggle it was and who you knew as well as what you did. Francis knew more people than Charles did.
In the middle of my time based at the house, I went away for a week and stayed in Menorca. And one end of the island in Menorca, where the British occupied for a while, is built very much in a kind of Spanish version of Georgian Britain. And while I was there, I suddenly had an idea about how it might have been for Frank to have been aboard ship at that time. Captain Frank Austen visits Port Mahon. My dear Cassandra, Frank is maid. He was yesterday raised to the rank of commander and appointed to the Petterel. That's from a letter by Jane Austen to her sister Cassandra in 1798. Strangely, you're still here on this Mediterranean island, hugger-mugger at fiesta, where a sweat of gin and sun, the clatter and heft of steaming horses, an immaculate Kaiser's rosewater blessing, and even the summer holiday scent of pisbuin summons the skin-sore sailor's salve of almond oil. So the tang of the old port rises, condensing on a Georgian window pane, through which, on the blue surge sea, we might glimpse a sail fill, a sloop turn in the breeze, and slip away towards Gibraltar. Jane Austen's brother, Edward, inherited the large manor house at the end of Chawton village, and that's how they came to be here. It was when he first moved into that with his family, had 11 children as well to accommodate. He moved his mother and sister and their friend Martha Lloyd into the house in the village, and that's the house which is now the Jane Austen House Museum. In the house in which Jane lived, they've recently discovered the original wallpaper, and in discovering it, they found that it appears to be probably a second, because at the time there was a tax on wallpaper, so it's very expensive to buy wallpaper, so it looks as if the Austen household bought, a cheap second and hung it. And you sort of ask yourself, well, why, if the brother was in this enormous house at one end of the village, why were they having to worry about hanging a second in their very small house in the village? So with that in mind, sometimes when you go back to the novels, you read something slightly different into Jane Austen's very acute sense of people who have, and perhaps those who have a little less, the poor relations.
I was noting in the other room about her sister and the close relationship they had as that deep bond, and how that was expressed in Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice. And, sometimes women writers, I think, can be perhaps dismissed that it was more frivolous and family matters and not War and Peace and those kind of issues. But I think it points up a lot of universal truths about how even today we live in Nigeria. And I think, you look at the status of women and girls, and oftentimes they're moving forward and realizing their potential is often tied to their marriages and having opportunities to leave their villages. And, Jane Austen, as a part of a very different society, still taps into that universal sense of how still today we wrestle with some of those challenges and issues around the world.
The manor house, which you can go and look around, has these amazing gardens, and the church is just beside it. Now it's a centre of scholarship, so it has a wonderful library of books by women writers, and just before Jane Austen's time and just after, so you can look at the influence of other literature on her life and her influence on other writers. But beside the house is the church, and that's where Jane's mother and sister Cassandra are both buried. So the fact that Jane, in the last 6 weeks of her life, moves into Winchester in order to be with her physician and dies there and is buried there seems a little sad and a bit chilly somehow when you see her memorial stone there, and then come later perhaps and visit the church in Chawton and see where her mother and her sister are buried side by side. So that sense that they were always together in the house and now they're no longer together. But I changed my mind a little bit about that, I think, because in the end I think, well, they're no longer there, and you have to think about the times that they shared the work and the days together in that house. At the grave of Cassandra and Mrs. Austen, St. Nicholas's Church, Chawton. Though mother and daughter, I'd thought of them as babes in the wood, tucked up, snug, beneath a quilt of moss, their lullaby, the soft tattoo of owl, the flit, flit, flit of bat. And I'd sorrowed for the absent sister, far from home, the green lane, the warm kitchen, the creaking door, all the comforts of the familiar, translated by death to brass and marble. But now I see the grave for what it is, a plot of stone and earth in shade. Now I picture them at work elsewhere, their hands gathering folds of cambric, morning light flooding their cheerful faces. One of the great things about this museum is that you are actually allowed to touch some of the exhibits, and Izzy Lewis, on a day out post A-levels with her grandparents, sat down for us and played at the square piano, very similar piano to the one that Jane Austen had herself and enjoyed playing.
I could imagine like kind of evenings, people meeting, people playing the piano like to amuse each other. So I think I was expecting something like that.
Maybe not expecting to have a go yourself.
Yeah, I know, not quite. They're normally like barriered off, you don't get to have a go. So yeah, it's quite nice.
So going into medicine, you're entering in a really wide world. You could take your medicine all over the world. Exactly. For Jane, she was very much at home. It's a different kind of life altogether. Do you feel about that as a young woman?
Yeah, it's interesting because they were saying earlier how she left school at the age of 11, so she literally, like, the opportunities were extremely limited to her. And I think it's impressive that she still managed to write about and like clearly understand the society that she was on the edge of. She still managed to write about that and like fully experience it, even though she maybe didn't have as many opportunities. So it shows that she had a very keen mind. It just makes you think, like, if she had managed to have a full education, if she had more opportunities, and it wasn't, this is a lovely place, but if she managed to explore the world a bit more, her books could have been, very different. It's quite interesting to think about.
There are literary houses up and down the country, and in preparing to open them to the likes of me to wander around, I suppose you have to accept that some of the things will be an approximation of something that might have belonged to the writer, something of the right period, not necessarily anything that's particularly to do with them. I didn't in the end think that mattered very much, and this poem is about the sense of perhaps what really matters when we visit a writer's house. The subjunctive mood. Well, we know that she might have, she probably would have, they tended to, possibly, in those days. We can assume that evidence suggests she is said to have, we can certainly imagine that, indeed it's likely at that time. And we could conclude from this, perhaps, an informed guess. But anyway, we have the novels.